Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to allow a couple more minutes here for others to join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Lexi Ducey with Eliason Group. So today's webinar is the hard ROI of scaling Agile, how to justify your investment in terms your CFO will understand. Today's presentation will be led by Philip Manquito, Eliason Group's Senior Agile Consultant, and Scott Blacker, AgileCraft's VP of Product and Services. Today's webinar is going to explore the best ways to justify your Agile investment by identifying the top tips to approaching ROI discussions within your enterprise, the business value drivers for an Agile organization, tooling strategies to maximize ROI, and other useful tips. Just some housekeeping before we begin. Please make sure that your phones are all muted if they aren't already. Also, feel free to address any questions you have in the comment box throughout the presentation. We'll take some time at the end of the webinar to answer a few questions. And any additional questions that we don't get to during the webinar, we will follow up along with the recording. We know how valuable everyone's time is, so we're going to try to wrap this webinar up right around 11:45 or so to buy you some time back in your day. I hope everybody enjoys this. Philip, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Lexi. Good afternoon. Thanks, everybody, for making time to join today's call. My name is Philip Manquito. I am a Senior Agile Delivery Leader for Eliason Group. I've been working in this space for a number of years now, primarily with organizations at scale, so large-scale enterprises, generally either in federal or commercial space. As neat as that may be, I'm most proud of the work that I do with my colleagues as part of Agile DC. So if you are in the DC area, our conference, I believe this year, is on the 16th of October. It's a great opportunity to come and engage with over 600 of your colleagues that are working to move the needle in our community. Scott? Oh, I'm sorry. With respect to Eliason Group, for those of you who don't know us, we are a 26-year-old IT staffing company based outside of Boston, Massachusetts. We have a national footprint, annual revenue in excess of $240 million, of which the Agile practice accounts for about $45 million. Eliason Group's Agile practice is a full life cycle Agile consultancy, the core services of which are advisory, coaching, training, as well as the ability to provide on-demand Agile subject matter expertise to support engagements of any scale.
Oh, great. Thanks, Philip. And hello, everybody. My name is Scott Blacker. I manage the product and services teams at AgileCraft. AgileCraft is a software company focused on helping companies simplify software at scale. We help large organizations scale Agile from the team level all the way up to the enterprise. Many large deployments, mostly customers that have 3, 5, 7, 1,000, 10,000, 15,000 developers, and focused on linking strategy to execution. Fun thing about AgileCraft, we were named last year Fortune 100's #1 best company to work for in America, and I can personally vouch for that. It's been a great kind of fun time here at AgileCraft. I work out of my house, so basically, my wife tells me that makes my basement the #1 place to work in America. So if any of you are in the DC area, it's a lot of fun here. Getting on to the webinar content, we have a couple of learning objectives for today. Here we go. First and foremost, we really want to focus on laying out and understanding what the role of the CFO is in an organization, the things that a CFO truly cares about, whether or not an organization has undergone the transformation to an Agile development organization, and then really help kind of talk to Agilists about how do you frame up the scaled Agile discussion in terms your CFO will understand. A lot of times we think of the role of the CFO as simply being a bean counter or only caring about the numbers, but it's much broader than that. So we will talk about the strategic aspects of how to frame the conversation as well as the hard ROI. And then finally, we'll walk through a couple of examples about how you measure the value, progress, and ROI along the way. How can you loop back 3 months in, 6 months in, 9 months in, and validate that the business case and justification that you put in place for driving a scaled Agile investment is actually paying off, and how do you measure that? So we'll walk through some examples there as well. So first, to kick us off here, what keeps the CFO up at night? And yes, it is about revenue, it is about EBITDA, it is about reducing churn and the core financial metrics of the business. That is, at the end of the day, the role of the CFO. But underpinning those things are the metrics and drivers that really at play that drive those core financial metrics. CFOs care a lot about missed delivery and the downstream ramifications. It affects the P&L. If you can't deliver a product on time and you miss your revenue targets, kind of as defined by the sales team. CFOs care a lot about quality, right, and the reduction of churn in the customer base if a low-quality product is put out. They're looking for ways to optimize a portfolio, looking for high ROI opportunities, and they care deeply about competitive advantage in the marketplace and what companies are doing to innovate, to stay ahead of the competition. Operationally, they care about execution risks. They want to understand where they're exposed in the context of things that would put the revenue plan for the company at risk, to get early visibility into things that might not go well. And to that end, they care deeply about connecting strategy to execution to ensure that the strategic plans that the board and the executive teams are putting in place to drive to market share are actually being executed against by the business. And to the extent that those things aren't happening, or the CFO or the executive team loses visibility, it introduces what is really unacceptable risk. So when we think of the CFO, we want to stay away from the stereotypes of I'm here to say no, or only bring me projects that have a financially backed business case, and I'm going to rank them, and I'm going to be counting the numbers in the beans, so to speak. The real role of a CFO spans a fairly kind of broad set of things in a fairly strategic lens. And so this comes from Deloitte. And we can think of the CFO as kind of responsible for 4 main areas, or filling 4 main roles in the organization. And this is important because when you go to talk to the CFO about why you want hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars to invest in scaled Agile consultants, to invest in process changes, to invest in tooling, to take the time to train the teams on how to execute their functions in a new world, the CFO kind of may cut across all 4 of these lenses, or they may be the type of CFO that's more of a strategist, or more of an operator, or more of a steward. And understanding the lens that your particular CFO is bringing to the table can really be important in terms of how you frame up the conversation. So we want to take a few minutes to get inside the head of the CFO and talk about the things that they might care about depending on kind of their orientation. Now, of course, the CFO is a steward, right? They are responsible for effective, timely, accurate books, compliance, optimized value delivery. And we'll get into some of the things that Scaled Agile helps do from a governance and compliance perspective, and from an alignment of strategy to visibility, so that the CFO can be ensured that the strategies they're putting in place are effectively executed against. Of course, the CFO is an operator and runs their finance organization. But then kind of often missed is the strategic role of the CFO, serving as a catalyst for the organization. The CFO is a great champion to partner with. They're focused on improving and optimizing the business. How do we drive change and innovation, not only into kind of the markets that we're going after, but into our business processes? And so if you think about kind of what agility does at the enterprise level for organization in terms of catalyzing the business and helping the organization move forward and compete better, the CFO could be a terrific ally and should inherently get the benefits of Scaled Agile, right, in their role as a change agent. And then finally, the CFO is on the executive team, right? They're a strategist and they're contributing. The role of the CFO as a purely numbers person is outdated, and many CFOs are kind of inheriting and supporting a lot of the COO, kind of type responsibility within an organization. They care a lot about strategy. They care a lot about innovation. They want to be sure that the company is not remaining stagnant. And so having your CFO aligned, your strategic CFO aligned to the long-term performance of the business is something that's really important. So let's break this out a little bit, right? Let's start by looking at the CFO as a strategist and catalyst, and then we'll look at the more tactical roles in just a second. And I think kind of a really important kind of thing to step back and think about from a industry strategy perspective, right, for kind of the Agile community, is to really reflect on what software and technology has become across the entire kind of economic landscape, right? We know the quote that software is eating the world, right? And if you look at the companies that are at the top of the NASDAQ today, the Facebooks, the Microsofts, these are the large technology companies that didn't exist 20, 30 years ago. The turnover and churn at the very top of our industry in terms of companies that are dominating in terms of market share and profitability are changing more rapidly than ever before. And to that extent, if you look at what's changing and what's driving that change, software has become a strategic asset to virtually every large organization. What that means is companies like Southwest Airlines, yes, they fly airplanes, but they compete on the basis of the reservation system. Large banks compete on the basis of the user experience in the context of online banking. Federal Express and package delivery services compete on the basis of the underlying technology that supports the user experience and delivery of services. These are things that a CFO deeply cares about. And then if you look at the long-term drivers of competitive advantage, and when I say competitive advantage, I mean profitability and the ability for a company to take margin and distribute it to shareholders or reinvest it in the long-term viability of the business. BCG came out with a report fairly recently. It looked back at the timeline, 1950s through present. And in 1950, the key driver of competitive advantage and profitability that a CFO would have cared mostly about was scale. And so GE was your dominant player in the space. They were the biggest. They had the biggest competitive advantage, right? They were the most profitable. At that point in time, if you were the biggest player in your space, it was 50% likely that you were also the most profitable in your space and had a source of long-term competitive advantage. Today, that percentage is less than 3%. Right? Scale is simply not a driver or indicator of long-term competitive advantage or profitability as it was historically. And what has replaced it? Agility. Right? The ability to be fast, flexible, nimble, responsive to customer demands, right, is the critical driver that's affecting the most important companies in our industry. And we in the Agile community are directly aligned to ways to affect the underlying competitive advantage and profitability of our firms. It's a matter of, when you're talking to your CFO, connecting the dots, and that's what today is about, for the things that we do in Scaled Agile, connecting those back to the things that a CFO wants. And strategically, CFOs innately get this. Right? They understand that agility is key to long-term growth and viability. Right? They want market differentiation, innovation, competitive advantage. They want to drive revenue and EBITDA growth. They want to reduce churn. Well, what does Scaled Agile do? Right? We deliver faster delivery cycles. Yet team level sprint does that. Team level does it at the sprint level. But when we're talking about scale, we're looking at macro level delivery cycles measured in months, not quarters, and not years. Right? We're flexible. We adopt to market change. We encourage change in the software development process. We drive innovation by empowering developers to think for themselves, to connect the work the development team is doing to the why of the organization, right? And we drive increased responsiveness by taking feedback from customers, inserting that directly into the development cycle. And so we think about this a lot of times. If the CFO is functioning at the top, we're talking about the strategic CFO here, right, as a catalyst. They're thinking about agility in the context of the enterprise and the portfolio level and where these investments should be made, right? What the company should be doing to drive long-term competitive advantage, right? And what Agile is doing is, and Scaled Agile specifically, is taking the decisions that the CFO is helping to drive and supporting in terms of the long-term commercial success of the business, and it's connecting it down through the various levels of scale all the way down to the team level. And that's where we start to say, okay, if the CFO is the strategist, is focusing on what the company needs to do to drive competitive advantage, and scaled agility is what enables them to take what's happening at the very top level and connect it to the work the teams are doing, then let's take a look at the CFO as the operator or steward of the business, right? Let's focus on how scaled agile processes and tools and methodologies connect the strategy right to the execution. And now let's talk about how the CFO, in their role as an operator and a steward of the business, can effectively drive quality, predictability, alignment, governance, reduce risk within the organization. And a lot of this comes from the simple fact that Agile at the team level is inevitable at this point. I can't think of a company that we've ever come across where somebody wasn't Agile somewhere in the organization. I guarantee you there are 10 developers somewhere that have self-formed a Scrum team and are sprinting, whether you think you're Agile or not. And so many organizations are in some state of an Agile transformation, intentional or otherwise. It's the reality and the way of the world. But what happens that exposes the CFO to an unacceptable level of risk in the context of their predictability is that teams locally optimized, when not transforming in the context of a scaled Agile process, a scaled Agile platform, right? The team will, each team will define their own way of doing things. They'll define their own workflow in their team level tool, right? The many team level tools don't encourage or allow for teams to collaborate with one another, and so you run into a problem somewhere along this kind of scale where it's either where teams either aren't effectively coordinating with each other, where teams who are coordinating, even if you have a Scrum of Scrum, right, aren't effectively connected to the portfolio, and you lose the thread of connectivity between what the organization is trying to do from a scale perspective in terms of incorporating agility into everything they do and the work the teams are actually doing. So what Scaled Agile does, it effectively links strategy to execution, and I think the premise for talking to CFOs strategically and connecting it to the things they care about is that, hey, CFO, if you don't embrace Scaled Agile, you risk losing visibility and alignment into what the teams are already doing right at the team level. And so I think that's an important concept to think through as we move forward here. And so with that, we'll start to transition into what are 5 tactical things that you, as a scaled agilist, can do to inform the conversation with your CFO. And with that, I'll pass it over to Philip to take us through these examples.
Yeah, so when engaging the CFO, there are several key value drivers which can be realized from the adoption of Agile at an enterprise level that you can arm yourself with. The first of which is the organization's ability to reduce cycle time. Next slide. Organizations with large batch or long-staying initiatives tend to have long as work moves through their traditional gated workflow. And yet most of these same organizations are able to implement a fix for a production defect in a matter of hours. In other words, despite the organization's heavy process flow, it's possible to produce a shippable increment of work that is considered done quickly. And there are multitude of benefits that an organization can realize by getting work done quickly around reducing bureaucracy, improving overall technical competencies, empowering individuals in the organization, fostering an environment of collaboration and accountability, self-organization, and that as we go through the sequence of events of completing work, we get better at it. And so you can see in organizations that if you only have to build once a year, for instance, you're willing to accept the pain of doing that. But if you're forced into a mode where we have to build nightly, well, now we're going to really focus on eliminating the pain that's going to prevent us from doing that with frequency, and we become more efficient. So these are definitely some areas where it creates that argument of wanting to get it done. Now, the basis of this concept was formulated by Edward Deming, whose early research in pursuit of understanding organizations built on quality became what is today known as the Shewhart cycle or Deming wheel. And basically, it establishes that there are a systemic series of 4 steps: plan, do, study, act. You can also hear this, you've heard this talked about as plan, do, check, act. And the idea is the sequence with which you complete these, the frequency with which you complete these 4 steps essentially have a direct correlation between activity and learning and the resulting benefits. So whereas before we deferred the benefits through these long project cycles, now we are realizing them with higher and higher degrees of frequency and exponentially compounding the benefits for the benefit of the organization itself. Teams using an Agile approach like Scrum at a local level are already embracing PDCA. And these practices scale, and as these practices scale higher into the program, so team of teams following PDCA, so do the corresponding benefits. There are several types of measurements for consideration when evaluating an organization's ability to reduce its cycle time.
Yep. Cool. So as we go through each one of these examples, and talk about the theory of how you connect and drive the metric, we also want to put some tactical examples in place. So, what can you do, as an Agilist to measure the reduction of cycle time, right? And what are some of the underlying things, so that when you go and talk to the CFO, it's not just about the strategy, right? It's not just about linking strategy to execution and those strategic arguments. It's making it very tactical for them, right? We are going to help the organization reduce cycle time, right? For all the reasons we just articulated. The reduction of cycle time is going to help drive profitability, help drive time to market, and we are going to be able to track the reduction of that cycle time on a very iterative basis and start coming back to you right away. If you care to see it. If not, know that us, the operators of the business in the operations group, are doing so, and we'll show you how we're reducing cycle time. We're showing you how we can track the cumulative flow of information through the system, right? And we'll show you how we're driving predictability via those shorter cycle times by measuring, and these screenshots come from AgileCraft, by measuring what's happening sprint over sprint, more importantly, program increment over program increment, quarter over quarter, in terms of how we're doing more to support the underlying premise. And so as we make the investment, we can come back and prove to you that we said we were going to do, we're doing what we said we were going to do, and we'll share empirical evidence from the systems and tools that are tracking this to help ensure the governance and compliance, right, and justification for the investment that we made. So these are 3 examples, kind of plenty more that we could think through, but certainly things that are very straightforward and fairly straightforward to track.
So another key value driver from the adoption of Agile at scale is the disciplined focus on understanding the minimum viable increment, or the MVI. Historically, large organizations, or even small organizations that are VC funded, fund initiatives one time over the course of a year. In other words, the organization is funding initiatives, not capacity to deliver work. The business knows that they only have one chance at bat, and rather than be strategic in what constitutes the scope of their initiative, the business will ask for everything, including the kitchen sink, whether it's truly important or not, as a hedge in the event the business can't get additional funding to iterate the initiative that they are undertaking at a later date. So the result is long project timelines. An initiative, however, is composed of different types of work that provides different grades of value. Agile organizations work collaboratively to understand which is of the highest value to the business and constitutes an end-to-end experience for the end user. So I'm sure everyone's heard of the term the steel thread, right? It's that end-to-end system functionality that is a baseline for that end user's experience. And we want to make sure that we're focusing on the fact that experience, that steel thread, is made of gold. So every initiative in an organization has gold, silver, and bronze. And we want to work to focus our efforts on providing or producing that which is of the highest value, ensuring that it is also potentially shippable. Click again, please. A focus on MBI can yield many benefits, including early ROI, as well as earlier feedback from customers and stakeholders who have now begun to use our product or service and can provide information, feedback with respect to what we should be adding in terms of future increments. And so that information, having that information or that deliverable out there can also help to mitigate the organization from over-engineering a solution at the outset, which can be inexpensive in its own right, as well as you can introduce a lot of unnecessary complexity into a platform that has to, or a product or service that has to be maintained now going forward. There are several types of measurements for consideration when focusing on the minimum viable increment.
Yep, that's great. So three specifically, kind of things that you could do to track this is one, in the top left here is a deep focus on tracking value delivery. And so what you're looking at here is a feature level burn down. I'm looking at the top left, right? We're looking at 7,000-8,000 story points delivered over 6 sprints by a full program. So let's say 10 teams, 6 sprints, 60 sprints worth of work here. And we're not focused on the story delivery. That's great that we're burning down stories as we wanted to. We're focused on the value delivery of features, and we're focused on making sure that the work that we're doing, right, are the most valuable features, and that those features are being developed and delivered in an incremental fashion throughout the context and course of the entire program, and that at the end of the program increment or whatever increment you're working on, that you've successfully executed against the delivery of the most important things, and that you've been able to do that in a complete and comprehensive fashion. From a road mapping perspective, the ability to drill into any given epic or initiative, look at the underlying features, right? Determine and see which ones are the most valuable, and ensure that those are the ones that you're driving towards completion first. Gives you a very kind of real-time, as-you-go perspective. So a CFO can look at the large-scale metrics in terms of earned value management and tracking the value of delivery, and they can then, if they so choose, or at least understand that you have the knowledge to choose, to drill into a roadmap or drill into a progress report to validate that the things you're working on are in fact the most important. Here you go, Philip.
Okay. So, and yet another key value driver from the adoption of Agile at scale is realized through the reduction of work in progress. What you see here is pretty routine in terms of portfolio backlogs and engagements that we've been part of. There are a bunch of large in-flight initiatives, but nothing's really being finished. Furthermore, most organizations don't have a bench of technical expertise of sufficient depth to support all of these projects. And so what happens is that the employees with the subject matter expertise are shared across multiple projects, and or the organization is forced to augment their workforce with contractors to account for unpredictable demand and or ongoing reprioritization in terms of what is most important at any given time. You click, please. So Agile organizations strive to create small cross-functional teams that are dedicated to finishing a specific initiative. In other words, we want to match capacity to deliver work based on the demand as a measure of MVI. In other words, we're focusing our capacity to that which is of the highest value to the organization. So in this model, we would seek to fund capacity and not initiatives, and the organization is then left to decide where to allocate its capacity in the form of high-performing purpose-built teams. After a team delivers the first MVI, the gold, so to speak, do we then focus as an organization on the silver? Is C a continuation of A? Or do we reorient the team's capacity to another initiative of higher value? Is C a new initiative entirely? Additionally, an organization incurs a lot of unnecessary expense by formulating and then standing up teams to complete an initiative. Over time, these teams become high-performing, right? That's the basis of the Tuckman model, among others. But when the initiative is completed, the teams are then dissolved. As new initiatives are then identified, the process is repeated. Well, there's a lot of waste an inefficiency here. Rather than dissolve the teams, better to bring the work to the high-performing team. And then, yes, there may be a learning curve there, but the cost of the organization will be significantly less than dissolving and reforming teams on an ongoing basis. So there are several types of measurements for consideration when correlating capacity to demand.
Cool. So the first and most obvious one, when you talk about that correlation and focusing on the most important things first and reduction of WIP through the process is simply measuring WIP and driving towards reduction. And so to the point that, just from basic, as we talked about, kind of operational Deming type theory, that the reduction of WIP drives kind of increases in throughput and kind of increased responsiveness, better you're better able to push product out the door faster and deliver value sooner. We can measure the reduction of WIP, and that's, well, okay. So the top left here, this is a bad example, right? Because this is one where the WIP is going up. So this is great, right? If you see this and you're a CFO and you understand that the idea was to reduce WIP over time, and you're looking at graphs that show that that increase is happening. That's a red flag, right? And that's exactly the kind of thing that you want to be able to measure to ensure that the value that you're claiming you'll be able to deliver in your justification to the CFO is being delivered by the organization. So the ability to reduce and manage WIP, to visualize WIP across all levels of the organization, and then finally to do things like manage and report on dependency risk. The more complicated and more interdependencies there are between different teams, between different projects, and the more sequencing that's required, the more your WIP is going to naturally be, right? 3 or 4 features are highly dependent and related to each other. They get knotted together. It gets kind of complicated. They sort of all go into process at the same time. You lose your ability to incrementally deliver the more complex you make your delivery ecosystem, as measured by the number of dependencies that exist. So let's look for ways to identify, track, measure, and reduce dependencies over time, right, as a leading indicator of things that will help reduce your WIP and therefore drive earlier delivery of product, increasing kind of revenue and helping to reduce churn and drive EBITDA across the organization. Here you go, Phil.
Yeah. So another key value driver from the adoption of Agile at scale is realized by aligning strategy more closely to execution. So while strategic organizational themes may take time to be realized, there must be a balance between the initial plan and the ability to accommodate change, simply recognizing the reality of the modern world. In other words, large batch cycles consume an organization's resources at the expense of enabling the organization's ability to pivot to accommodate changes in business priority. The potential for disconnect between strategy and execution makes the organization subject to the greater potential for unnecessary waste and inefficiency in the system itself, which can then undermine the organization's ability to achieve its strategic objectives. There are several measurements for consideration when correlating alignment between strategy and execution.
Yep. So number one there is simply going to be to track and match the correlation between the investments that you're making to actual spend within the organization. And this is something we help many organizations do at AgileCraft through the use of the software, which is to say, okay, here's our investment. Now that may be a project-based or epic-based investment. It may be a lean agile investment where we funded the programs themselves and then kind of allocated a % of spend across a number of strategic themes. But then let's look at the actual, what stories are actually being built. What are the team's costs that are building the stories? Effectively, how much does it cost to deliver a story point from the organization? And how many story points at the team level are being allocated to features, epics, themes, strategies? We can measure that up and down the stack so we can get a very high-level macro kind of report that can trend and look at the intent of the dollars that you, the CFO, intended to spend across the strategy of the organization and compare that to the number of stories that are actually being built against each one of those key themes or strategies and look to understand, is my investment going to where I actually thought it was going to be? Something very basic but very deep and very hard to do if you don't have a scaled agile approach and investment across your organization and the teams are acting kind of on an independent basis focused only on story points locally optimized to what the teams are doing. And of course, you want to be able to visualize the alignment of strategy to execution and show that. And you want to be able to give comfort to the fact that you're not only looking at a retroactive report that's looking at how are you matching investments to actual spend, but that you're able to validate the progress against that, to validate that the things you're working on and the things you're completing first are the most important on a real-time basis. And so the understanding and the ability to report on the correlation between investments and actuals, the ability to visualize the connectivity of strategy to execution, the ability to drill into that and validate progress at any given point in time gives comfort to kind of the operator role, the CFO, that what we said we were going to do is what we're doing.
So lastly, leadership at every level of an organization has a fiduciary responsibility and therefore an interest in organizational governance. Virtually every type of organization is subject to some form of regulation. Some examples that come to mind include federal legislation like Dodd-Frank, or the implication of Sarbanes-Oxley in financial services, HIPAA in pharma or healthcare, or even PCI for companies of any size that accept credit card payments. The bottom line is that the majority of Agile organizations can demonstrate traceability from the highest expression to the lowest expression of work, along with the corresponding validation that work has integrity. Additionally, it can be easier to operationalize the financial reporting. So there are several types of measurements for consideration when looking to enable governance.
Yeah, so thanks, Philip. So, number one here, right? What does a CFO care about? And particularly in an Agile organization where these things can be relatively difficult. So, from a compliance perspective, how do we audit and trace the work? How do we ensure that, from a SOX perspective or from a traceability perspective, we can dig deep into and understand, for any given piece of work, whether it was capitalized or not, how do we trace that back to the people that were doing the work, the teams that touched it, the dependencies, the external vendors that may have come into contact with it, et cetera. So using a systematic approach and tracking the work that you're doing in a system that allows you to go from top to bottom is something that would be very important to a CFO. How do you effectively prevent the loss of governance and traceability in an organization where the teams are agile? And the answer, very simply, is a scaled agile approach that connects strategy to execution and connects all the components of the work that goes into delivering software into a highly traceable format. The ability to measure CapEx and OpEx, the ability to define what is capitalized or not at the epic feature and story level, the ability to understand what kind of tasks are capitalized, and then roll that back up, right, to ensure that capital spending is in line with organizational objectives, particularly for your public company CFOs, is something that's really important. And then, of course, if you do track time, which many large organizations do, particularly in the context of vendor work, that's something that you want to capture in the context of your Agile execution, whether or not you're tasking stories and rolling that time into a system so that developers don't have to do double entry, or whether you're tracking it in a third-party system and ultimately consolidating it for the purposes of reporting. And so with that, that's pretty much what we wanted to cover today. In summary, whether you're using a commercial framework like Save for Dad or Less or Spotify, or whether you have your own blend of techniques or things that you're doing to scale Agile, the important thing when you talk to the CFO is to recognize, are you talking to the CFO as a strategist and a catalyst, or as an operator or a steward? To connect the things the CFO cares about in terms of strategic things like market differentiation or competitive advantage versus predictability and alignment, right, and predictability and alignment, to connect those things to what you can bring to the table from a scaled Agile perspective, and then to connect those things to the specific evidence points and the empirical evidence kind of reports, processes, and insights that you'll bring to bear to validate the fact that you, the scaled Agilist, by doing these things in the middle, help to deliver against the things that a CFO cares about. And with that, we'll conclude the content portion of today's webinar. Thank you all very much, and I'll ask Lexi, do we have questions from the audience?
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Bill. Yes, we've got a few minutes here for some questions. So I guess the first question might be most appropriate for Scott, but I'm sure you can both touch on this. The question is, what about aligning spend to results, not just where the spend was intended? For example, matching the cost that a feature costs to the increase in revenue that the feature delivers. How is that best measured?
Yeah, that's exceptional question. So a couple of things. So we have a concept in AgileCraft we call success criteria, right? And those are, but whether you're using success criteria or any metric, effectively you want to pick specific metrics: revenue, net promoter score, website clicks, things that drive results for the company and the business in terms of the delivery of value, and you want to tie those things back to the work, right, that drove those improvements. So, for example, in an Agile context, I've got 3 features, and those features are all driven towards one of the success criteria for whether or not those features impacted kind of our revenue, our EBITDA, our churn reduction in the market is, did those features correlate to increases in net promoter score or web clicks, right? Because the increase in NPS would be correlated with an increase in churn reduction and higher customer satisfaction. Let's put those metrics in the system. Let's tie those systematically to the features that directly support them. Let's track the increase in net promoter score. Let's track the timing of when those features were introduced, and let's graph those things against one another and measure the increases in revenue, net, whatever that end user value-based metric is, and tie that directly back to the work that we did. And then let's go back to the CFO and show them the correlation. And I fully recognize that there's a lot of things that drive net promoter score, not just the delivery of 3 features, but we often get that value question, and that is a terrific place to start that effectively does tie end metrics in the market to the work the development teams are doing in a scaled Agile environment. So thank you, great question.
Thanks, Scott. Another question is, how do you align decisions versus work to auditing?
You got that one, Philip? Or could you repeat the question, Lexi?
Sure. The question is, how do you align decisions versus work to auditing?
Scott, do you have a take on that?
I'm trying to think and understand the question. So how do I align decisions to work to auditing? Yeah, I'm a little bit lost in the question. I mean, I think the decisions that are made primarily in the key decisions that we made in a scaled Agile context are prioritization, kind of at all levels of the organization. And so, I'm thinking that maybe means we're making decisions at various levels of the hierarchy in terms of the work that we're going to do and prioritizing that. That we're effectively parenting work from the story to the feature to the epic to the theme, and that parenting allows for traceability, right, and audit in terms of doing what you said you were going to do and the delivery of work against kind of the core success of the business. And then we're looking at process steps and value streams, and the traceability of those work items through process steps at all levels of the hierarchy would enable an auditor, whether it's from a SOX perspective or just a process execution perspective, to look at, hey, do we follow the process we said we were going to do? Do we have the right measures and checks in place from a prioritization standpoint? And then as that work goes through a process flow or a value stream, did we check all that? And then can I systematically look to do that? So I think my take would be that naturally happens as part of the scaled Agile work breakdown process and would naturally be enabled by tooling that connects those things with the correct audit and traceability reports. But whomever asked the question, I'm happy to follow up after this if I misunderstood the question. Thank you.
Brian, if you're still with us and you want to provide some more context on that question, if we didn't answer it well, just shoot us another comment and we'll follow up on that. Another question is each task determined for capitalization, or is there a standard template for work?
Yeah, so that's probably if that's a tooling question from AgileCraft, you define it at the task level. So and as an organization, you would say, okay, well, we've got 10 different types of development tasks, and these 3 types of tasks are capitalizable, and these 7 types are not. And therefore, whenever one of those task types is defined as part of a story, it goes into one of those 2 buckets. So I think it's it's sort of up to the organization to define. Of course, there's standards in the industry that would say what should be capitalized or what not, and That I think any kind of agile process would lay out those tasks, and of course AgileCraft has templates that help get you started. But at the end of the day, it's something that you would also choose to do as part of an implementation.
Great. Yeah, we've got time for, it looks like, one or two more questions. So the next question I will ask is, let's see, we've got a bunch coming through right now. But when is the right time to engage your CFO in these kind of conversations?
So Scott and I had maybe anticipated this question, and the answer is really at any time. Ideally, if you're at the beginning of your journey, it's a great time to begin to help the CFO change the thinking, the mindset required to support what is going to have to occur in order for this transformation to be realized. Alternately, you could have an instance where, for instance, the beachhead for the transformation is initiated within the delivery part of the organization, and so we create the capability within the delivery organization. At some point, what we would want is the funding model to change, and so that may take time before there's sufficient progress established, momentum established, where you really get the CFO to take notice and then begin to engage them in a conversation around changing the funding precedent from initiative-based to capacity-based, and then beginning to demonstrate the value that approach can provide through the work that the teams are doing. But even then, it's still going to take time for that change in funding precedent to take place. It isn't generally something I've seen that occurs relatively quickly.
Great, and then we'll end on this next question right here. Philip, this one's also mostly directed at you. What typical impediments can a CFO help to remove that will enable an agile transformation?
I think that's related to first and foremost the last comment, which is the funding precedent. Creating an organization that is designed to look at funding capacity on an ongoing basis. So not just once a year, but over the course of the year, and being flexible enough to be able to change or pivot based on priority. So, again, we either continue to fund the goal-based initiatives, and then we have to decide: do we work on the silver, or do we work on something else? So that would be certainly an area. But also, an agile CFO is considered an agile leader in the organization. So we would be relying on that person to engage as an evangelist in terms of what's going on and showing the support, modeling the behaviors of an agile leader, and essentially supporting the larger adoption. It isn't simply let's check the box. Our funding precedent has now been changed. We should be fine. Yeah, you are simply filling or resolving a particular matter, but changing culture is an area that embraces or encompasses everybody in the organization, including the CFO.
Great, thank you, Philip. All right, well, I think we'll end on that. Buy everybody back some time. So again, thank you everybody for attending today's webinar. We hope it was a great use of your time. We will follow up with the recording of this presentation, and we'll touch base on any of the questions that we weren't able to address. Thank you to Philip and Scott for their time today. And of course, thank you to Stephanie over at AgileCraft for help in organizing this. On behalf of Elias and AgileCraft, we hope you enjoyed the presentation and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.